Hi, good morning. So in this week's Parsha, God says to Moses, "They shall make for me a sanctuary." And Moses gets detailed instructions on how to construct this dwelling. In the last few weeks, we transitioned from this dramatic revelation at Sinai where we received the 10 Commandments to a comprehensive legal code in Mishpatim to this week's construction instructions. And we're reminded that ethical living isn't just about that spiritual heights, but also about details of day-to-day life, how we organize our communities, and how we care for the most vulnerable among us. The theme of the Parsha lends itself to the collective efforts required for a society to build a project that is truly great. The work of this Refugee Shabbat is to help reclaim our national and communal project as a country and as a community made up of immigrants by lifting up a narrative of welcome, of safety, and of security. The Parsha's focus also on the materials and blueprints to execute the project correctly can come across as pretty technical and tedious. I don't necessarily look to lists and bureaucracy for inspiration, but they are often what enable a society like ours to live out our values or fail in our implementation. The focus on the technical isn't so relevant to us today, but the notion that we can save lives, not because we have power per se, but rather because of a willingness to make a commitment and to bring our own gifts. Let's relate this a little bit to our current context. I think we all know and feel that we're living in a polarizing time. And it probably won't surprise many of you to know that anti-immigrant sentiment here in Canada is sharply on the rise. A fall 2024 report from the Environics Institute shared that for the first time in a quarter century, a majority of Canadians say there's too much immigration. Almost 6 in 10 Canadians now believe the country accepts too many immigrants, reflecting a percentage point increase from 2023, building on another percentage point increase from the previous year. It's really the most rapid change in opinions from year to year since they started doing these analyses in 1977. And the findings suggest that public opinion on immigration has basically flipped from seeing it as acceptable, if not valuable, to problematic. So the public isn't feeling particularly welcoming today for newcomers to welcome the stranger. So in this landscape, Refugee Shabbat is a time for us to remember that in Canada's recent memory, there was a time when none was too many, and people felt that Canada would be better off without Jewish immigrants and refugees. We know from our experience that anyone can be a refugee, and that there is not a singular refugee archetype. I come by this work honestly. My parents and brother came to Canada as refugees from Romania in the early 1980s, and JIAS was their sponsor. Refugees have helped build our country and very much our community. Refugees have skills, talent, drive, and they are resilient, risk takers, you could say. We have been refugees and we have been the stranger. So what I'm asking for today, I'm looking for you to make that commitment to be welcoming. Beth Tzedec has really been an example of this, a leader in the GTA welcoming the stranger with us at JIAS. You, Beth Tzedec, have offered a sanctuary by offering the Warwick property, I'm not really pointing in the right direction, to newcomer families through this unique partnership that JIAS has with Airbnb.org. Many of you here in this room have been involved in refugee sponsorship with JIAS, committing not just your dollars, but your time, energy, and care to help a family settle well. Some of you, I think, have tutored newcomers in English, shared your professional network, maybe hosted a family for a meal, or made a donation. And all of us can find some gift, some capacity to be welcoming, to welcome newcomers into our community, especially when it feels like our country might feel a little less welcoming today than it did a few years ago. To be a Jew is to know what it means to be a stranger in a strange land. Displacement is woven into our history, into our collective memory. Abraham was commanded to leave his land, his home, and his family. The Israelites were strangers in Egypt. Moses was in exile before leading the Israelites to freedom, and many more recent, current, modern examples as well. The Torah insists, through the retelling of the Exodus story at Pesach, like Rabbi mentioned, through the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread, that we never forget what it feels like to be vulnerable, to be displaced, to be a stranger, or at least we're not supposed to forget. The commandment to protect the stranger isn't arbitrary. It's rooted in the lived experience of the Israelites. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. This is not just a legal rationale, it's a deeply personal appeal to remember, to empathize. The Torah is teaching us something fundamental about human nature. It's easy to forget. It's easy to forget the pain we once found for ourselves, when we find ourselves now in positions of power and comfort. It's easy to otherize the stranger, to see them as different or less deserving of our compassion. But the repetition of these statements, welcome the stranger, do not oppress the stranger, they serve as a constant reminder to us, urging us not to forget our own history and extend empathy to those who now stand where we once stood. And just as crucially, the Torah reminds us that the stranger too is made in the image of God. In the divine image, every person carries inherent dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. This means that our ethical responsibility is not merely about kindness, it's about recognizing the sacred worth of each human being, no matter where they come from. And they're worthy. In the Canadian context too, it's not just about being nice, Canadian stereotype, to others. It's about recognizing that immigrants give more than they take, because today's immigrants are tomorrow's leaders. Look around the room. Today, we dedicate our collective Shabbat experience to the nearly 40 million refugees fleeing war, persecution, violence, and environmental devastation, seeking safety and a chance to build their lives. That's right, I said 40 million. The number of refugees in the world today is as big as the entire population of Canada. So, we're called to confront indifference. We're challenged to see beyond the headlines and statistics and recognize the human stories, the dreams and fears, hopes and talents. Like our ancestors, they are forced to flee their homes and communities, seeking what we all seek: safety, dignity, and a bright future for their children, opportunities. The Torah commandment to protect the stranger is a timeless imperative that speaks directly to our present. It demands that we pursue justice relentlessly, confront our own prejudices, and ask, do we recognize the humanity reflected in the eyes of the stranger? And while the stranger may not be made in my image or your image, they are without question made in God's. So we don't need to be overwhelmed by the scale. I don't expect the people in this room to solve the entire refugee crisis. However, we can all be engaged, because after all, to save one life is to save the world. Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you, Beth Tzedec, for your partnership and being so welcoming. Shabbat shalom.